In ancient Rome, marriage was not born in romance. It was forged in power, property, and ritual. Love, if it existed at all, was secondary, almost irrelevant. What mattered was lineage, control, and the visible transfer of a woman from the authority of her father to the domination of her husband. Nowhere was this transfer more brutally symbolized than on the wedding night itself, a night Rome later tried desperately to sanitize, soften, and eventually erase from its official memory. To the modern mind, a wedding night is imagined as intimate, tender, and private. In Roman society, it was none of these things. A Roman bride was often young, sometimes barely into her teens. She had been raised knowing her body was never truly hers. First it belonged to her father, the paterfamilias, whose legal power over her life was absolute. On her wedding day, that power did not disappear, it was simply handed over. The wedding night was the ceremonial proof that the transfer was complete. The ceremony itself was already filled with unsettling symbolism. The bride wore a flame-colored veil, the flammeum, evoking fire, sacrifice, and purity all at once. She was torn, sometimes literally, from her mother's arms in a ritual reenactment of ancient bride capture traditions. This was no accident. Roman writers openly acknowledged that marriage echoed abduction, conquest, and submission. The message was clear, resistance was expected, and obedience was the ultimate virtue. As night fell, the procession moved toward the groom's house. Friends and family followed, shouting crude jokes, singing obscene verses known as fescennine songs, and openly mocking the sexual acts about to occur. This was not meant to embarrass. It was meant to dominate. The bride's fear was part of the performance. When the couple reached the threshold, another ritual awaited. The groom lifted the bride over the doorway so she would not stumble. Officially, this was to avoid bad luck. Unofficially, Roman historians tell us, it symbolized that she entered the home not of her own will, but by force. Even superstition was shaped to reinforce power. Inside the house, things grew darker. Unlike modern expectations, the wedding night was rarely private. Witnesses, sometimes trusted family members or servants, might remain nearby. In elite households, the bedding itself could be inspected afterward. Blood on the sheets was not merely expected, it was evidence. Proof of virginity was proof of honor, legitimacy, and male ownership. A bride who failed this test could face humiliation, rejection, or worse. But there was an even more disturbing layer, one Rome would later try to bury. Early Roman sources and later commentators hint at practices that blurred the line between ritual and violation. In some traditions, the consummation of the marriage was not entirely left to the husband. Certain wedding customs involved symbolic or literal intervention by others to prepare the bride, ensuring she would be compliant, fertile, and submissive. Roman poets joked about it. Legal scholars avoided the details. Christian-era historians condemned it without explanation. The silence itself is telling. One such custom revolved around the invocation of Mutunus Tutunus, an archaic Roman fertility deity represented by a massive phallus. Brides were said to sit upon or touch the idol before consummation. Officially, this act was meant to ensure fertility. But beneath the religious language was a stark message. The bride's body was a communal concern, regulated and ritualized by society, not a private domain. Some historians argue this was symbolic only. Others point to references suggesting that older male relatives or designated figures played a role in initiating the bride, particularly in very early Roman tradition. Whether literal or exaggerated over time, the belief itself shaped behavior. Fear, expectation, and silence did the rest. What is undeniable is that Roman law did not recognize marital rape. Consent was not a concept applied to wives. Once married, a woman's body was legally accessible at all times. The wedding night was not about mutual desire, it was about activation, turning a woman into a wife through sex, whether she was ready or not. The bride's role was passive. Roman texts praised the univira, the woman who had known only one man, her husband. Her virtue was measured not by happiness, but by endurance. Tears on the wedding night were expected. In fact, a bride who did not cry was sometimes viewed with suspicion. This normalization of fear was not accidental. Rome was a society built on conquest. Its values were forged in war, slavery, and domination. The household was a miniature empire, and the husband was its ruler. The wedding night was the moment that empire was claimed. Yet even as Rome expanded, its elite began to feel uneasy about its own traditions. By the late Republic and early Empire, writers started to soften their descriptions. Rituals were reframed as symbolic. Crude songs were dismissed as jokes. The darker implications of communal involvement in the wedding night faded from polite literature. Why? Because Rome was changing. As Greek philosophy influenced Roman thought, and later Christianity reshaped morality, the brutality of early customs became embarrassing. What once symbolized strength now looked like savagery. The same civilization that proudly recorded its massacres and enslavements suddenly grew quiet when it came to its bedrooms. By the time Christian emperors ruled Rome, marriage was rebranded as sacred, moral, and restrained. The wedding night became private, at least in theory. Older rituals were condemned as pagan obscenities. Temples to fertility gods were destroyed. Texts were edited, lost, or intentionally vague. But erasure does not mean absence. Fragments remain, in poetry, legal debates, condemnations, and jokes that no longer seem funny. They hint at a past where a bride's fear was ritualized, where privacy was a luxury, and where the wedding night was less about love and more about power being made flesh. Rome tried to erase this night from history not because it was insignificant, but because it revealed too much. It exposed the truth beneath the marble statues and noble speeches that even at its most intimate moments, Rome was an empire built on control, and the wedding bed was no exception. Rome prided itself on order, law, and civilization. Its roads were measured, its legions disciplined, its legal codes admired even centuries later. Yet beneath this polished surface lived customs so unsettling that later Roman writers chose silence over truth. One such custom, never formally written into law, never openly endorsed, yet whispered across generations, was the ritual surrounding a bride's wedding night. Unlike modern ceremonies filled with romance and privacy, early Roman marriage was not primarily about love. It was a contract between families, bloodlines, and property. A woman was not joining a husband, she was being transferred, and on the wedding night, that transfer had to be violently, unmistakably complete. Roman historians left gaps where this ritual should have been. No official scroll details it step by step. But fragments survive in legal disputes, satirical poems, moral condemnations, and nervous Christian critiques written centuries later. When assembled, they reveal a practice so disturbing that Rome eventually tried to bury it. The ritual revolved around symbolic conquest. Romans believed marriage reenacted the city's founding myth, the rape of the Sabine women, where Rome's first men seized wives by force to ensure the city's survival. To Romans, this was not shameful history, it was sacred precedent. Marriage was meant to echo that act of domination, reminding both bride and groom that Rome itself was built on violence disguised as necessity. On the wedding night, the bride was expected to resist, not genuinely, not in a way that could prevent the act, but symbolically. Roman writers hinted that a bride who entered marriage too willingly was seen as immodest, even dishonorable. Resistance proved virtue, fear proved purity. Tears were not only expected, they were encouraged. One Roman poet described brides being carried over the threshold as if captured, a detail often romanticized today. In reality, this was no gentle lift. The act symbolized abduction, not affection. The bride's feet were not allowed to touch the threshold because that would imply consent. She had to be taken. Inside the marital chamber, the ritual deepened. Friends of the groom, sometimes older male relatives, were permitted to remain nearby, listening. Their presence was meant to witness the consummation indirectly, ensuring the marriage was sealed. In some accounts, bawdy jokes and chants were shouted through the door, mocking the bride's fear and encouraging the groom's dominance. Privacy, as we understand it, did not exist. More chilling were references to the ius primae noctis-like customs, not officially codified but practiced in certain regions or elite households. In these cases, an elder male, sometimes the father of the groom or a powerful patron, claimed symbolic authority over the bride's first night. Scholars debate whether this always involved physical participation or ritual supervision, but multiple sources suggest that the bride's autonomy was entirely absent. Her body was treated as a ceremonial object, passed through male authority before belonging to her husband. Rome later denied this ever happened. By the late Republic and early Empire, writers became uncomfortable. They reframed the ritual as metaphor. They softened the language. They pretended the violence was only symbolic. But the earlier sources do not allow such easy escape. One legal text discusses a bride who fought too hard, who scratched and bit her husband badly enough to injure him. The court did not praise her courage. It questioned her moral character. Excessive resistance was seen as rebellion, not virtue. The ritual demanded submission at the correct moment, no sooner, no later. This reveals the true horror of the custom. It trained women to perform fear. From childhood, Roman girls were taught that their wedding night would be terrifying, and that terror was honorable. Mothers warned daughters not to scream too loudly, not to injure the groom, not to shame the family. The fear had to be convincing but controlled. Pain was expected. Silence afterward was mandatory. The next morning, proof of consummation mattered more than the bride's well-being. Blood-stained sheets were sometimes displayed or quietly inspected. Their absence could lead to accusations, not against the groom but against the bride. She might be labeled deceitful, defective, or cursed. Rome justified all of this through tradition. It is how it has always been, they said. It is how the gods intended, they claimed. It is how Rome remains strong. But cracks appeared. As Rome expanded and absorbed other cultures, some questioned the cruelty. Greek-influenced philosophers argued that marriage based on terror weakened households. Early Christian writers condemned the ritual as pagan savage. Eerie. They spoke of brides traumatized, of nights that felt like sanctioned assault rather than union. And yet, even as Rome publicly reformed marriage laws, the shadow ritual persisted. It moved behind closed doors. It lost its chance. It dropped its witnesses. But the expectation remained: a bride must be taken, not welcomed. By the 4th century, Roman officials actively erased references to the practice. Texts were edited, poems were reinterpreted. What could not be erased was dismissed as exaggeration or myth. But trauma leaves traces. Medical writings from late antiquity describe brides suffering from night terrors, fainting spells, and lifelong aversion to intimacy. The authors blamed weak constitutions, not the ritual itself. Rome could conquer nations, but it could not admit its own brutality. What makes this ritual especially horrifying is not just the act, but its institutional approval. This was not crime, it was culture. It was celebrated with songs, laughter, and religious blessing. The gods were invoked, the ancestors were honored, and the bride's terror was part of the ceremony. Rome tried to erase it because it contradicted the image it wanted history to remember, a rational empire of law and progress. But beneath the marble statues and legal codes was a darker truth, that Rome's power was forged not only through war, but through intimate violence ritualized and sanctified. The wedding night was Rome in miniature, order imposed through force, silence demanded after suffering, tradition used as justification. And that is why this ritual, more than many battlefield atrocities, was quietly buried, because it revealed that the empire's cruelty did not end at the city gates. It followed women into the most private room of their lives, and the wedding night in ancient Rome. The bride's first ordeal was not consummation, but the threshold. What appears in surviving Roman literature as a symbolic crossing was, in reality, one of the most psychologically violent rituals imposed on Roman women. The doorway of the groom's house was not merely an entrance, it was a stage where domination, ownership, and ritualized fear converged. Roman historians such as Plutarch and Varro described the moment with disturbing calm. The bride was deliberately lifted, dragged, or carried over the threshold, never allowed to step across it herself. Officially, this gesture was said to honor an ancient myth, one in which early Roman brides were abducted during the Sabine women incident, entering their husbands' homes unwillingly. But beneath the myth was a darker, more practical purpose, to erase the bride's agency from the very first step of marriage. The ritual sent a clear message. This was not her home. She was not entering by choice. She was being taken. The myth that masked violence. Roman writers framed the act as tradition, claiming it prevented bad luck should the bride stumble. But many scholars now agree this explanation was a sanitized lie. The real symbolism lay in reenacting Rome's foundational crime, the mass kidnapping and forced marriages of Sabine women. By carrying the bride, the groom was reenacting conquest, reminding everyone present that Roman marriage was rooted in female submission through force. This ritual was public. Family members, guests, neighbors, and household slaves watched as the bride, often trembling, sometimes crying, was lifted and carried inside. Her resistance, if any, was expected. In fact, a bride who did not resist was considered shameful, as resistance proved her chastity and virtue. The paradox was cruel. She had to appear unwilling to show she was pure, yet compliance was inevitable. For elite Roman women, this moment was especially humiliating. They were often educated, literate, and politically valuable. But at the threshold, none of that mattered. In that instant, they were reduced to a symbolic body being transferred from one man's authority to another's. Blood on the doorposts. The humiliation did not end at the threshold. Once inside, the bride was required to perform another unsettling act. She anointed the doorposts with animal fat and wool, sometimes mixed with blood. This ritual, supposedly meant to ward off evil spirits, echoed far older fertility rites, ones tied to sacrifice and bodily control. Some accounts suggest the fat came from sacrificed animals offered earlier that day, while others hint at something far more disturbing: blood drawn intentionally to mark the home. Whether literal or symbolic, the message was unmistakable. The bride's presence was sanctified through violence. In certain regions, the groom's household slaves would chant crude verses as the bride crossed inside. These verses, preserved in fragments of Roman wedding songs, often referenced sex, obedience, and fertility in explicit terms. The bride, still veiled, was expected to remain silent. Silence itself was a ritual, the erasure of identity. Before marriage, a Roman woman belonged legally to her father under patria potestas. After crossing the threshold, she passed into manus, the hand of her husband. This was not metaphorical. Under manus marriage, the woman ceased to exist as an independent legal entity. She could not own property, make contracts, or inherit wealth in her own name. The threshold ritual marked this legal death. Some Roman jurists explicitly referred to marriage as a form of civil death for women, and the doorway symbolized the point of no return. Once carried inside, the bride was no longer her father's daughter-in-law. She was her husband's possession. Even her name began to fade. Roman women were often identified only by their family name in feminine faux. Julia, Cornelia, Livia. After marriage, they were increasingly referenced as wife of, rather than as individuals. The threshold was where this erasure began, fear as a tool of control. Ancient Roman texts reveal something chilling. The bride was expected to be afraid. Fear was not an unfortunate side effect, it was an intentional component of the ritual. Roman writers believed that a frightened bride would be more obedient, more faithful, and more fertile. This belief tied into Roman medical theories of the female body, which claimed women were naturally passive, porous, and easily shaped by male authority. Fear, they believed, opened the body for conception. Thus, terror became fertility. Some brides reportedly fainted during the crossing, others wept uncontrollably. None of this stopped the ceremony. In fact, such reactions were interpreted as proof that the ritual was working. There are even accounts of brides being lightly struck or jostled as they were carried, ostensibly playful but unmistakably threatening. Laughter from male guests often followed. The complicity of society. What makes the threshold ritual especially horrifying is not just its cruelty, but its collective endorsement. Mothers who had once endured the same humiliation stood by silently. Female relatives offered no protest. Slaves, many of whom had no legal right to refuse, participated in the chants and preparations. Rome normalized this violence so thoroughly that it became invisible. By the late Republic, some elite women entered marriages without manus, retaining limited legal independence. Yet the ritual of the threshold persisted, stripped of legal necessity but preserved for its symbolic power. Even when women gained slight freedoms, the performance of domination remained. This persistence suggests the ritual was less about law and more about ideology, about reminding women, aga, in and again of their place. Why Rome tried to erase it. As Rome transitioned into a Christian empire, many pagan marriage rites were quietly abandoned or reinterpreted. The threshold ritual, with its overt violence and sexual symbolism, became inconvenient. Christian marriage emphasized consent, at least in theory, and the image of a terrified bride being carried like captured property clashed with emerging moral narratives. Rather than openly condemning the practice, Roman and later medieval writers sanitized it, reframing it as a charming tradition or symbolic gesture. Over time, its darker meanings were buried beneath myth, poetry, and romantic reinterpretation, but the truth remains in the fragments. The threshold ritual was not a harmless custom. It was a carefully choreographed act of psychological domination, designed to break a woman's autonomy before the marriage even began. And once she crossed that blood-marked doorway, there was no turning back. By the time the wedding feast ended and the guests staggered home through Rome's torchlit streets, the bride's fate was already sealed. Laughter faded, wine cups emptied, and musicians packed away their instruments. But for the young woman at the center of the celebration, the night was only beginning. What awaited her was not intimacy, tenderness, or mutual joy. It was a ritualized ordeal rooted in domination, fear, and obedience, one Rome later tried desperately to forget. Roman brides were often terrifyingly young, some barely past childhood. 12 was considered a legal age for marriage, and in elite families, girls were sometimes promised even earlier. These brides were raised with one unbreakable lesson: silence was virtue. A woman's pain, whether physical or emotional, was not meant to be spoken. It was meant to be endured. As the bride was led from her father's house, she was expected to resist, sometime violently. This resistance was not symbolic affection for her family, it was a reenactment of Rome's legendary past. Roman historians claimed it honored the mythic rape of the Sabine women, the violent seizure of wives that supposedly built Rome itself. The bride's fear, tears, and struggle were not unfortunate side effects, they were the point. Once inside her new husband's home, the ritual intensified. The threshold was considered sacred, and the bride was often carried across it to prevent her from stumbling, an omen of future disobedience. But in reality, this act reinforced a darker truth. From this moment on, her body no longer belonged to her. It belonged to her husband, his household, and the lineage he intended to continue. Roman writers described the wedding night in euphemisms: the binding, the union, the completion. Rarely did they describe what truly occurred, but scattered references, legal texts, and surviving commentaries reveal a grim picture. Consent was irrelevant. A wife was expected to submit completely, regardless of terror or pain. The law offered her no protection. Marriage itself was considered perpetual consent. Some brides were subjected to deliberate humiliation. The groom, or older women overseeing the ritual, might verbally degrade her, reminding her of her new inferiority. In certain households, the bride's cries were mocked as necessary, even beneficial. Roman superstition claimed that a woman who wept loudly on her wedding night would be more obedient and fertile. Silence, ironically, was suspicious. The psychological toll was immense. These girls were torn from childhood and thrust into adulthood in a single night, with no preparation and no escape. Roman society celebrated masculine dominance as virtue. A man who was too gentle risked being seen as weak. A bride who resisted too little risked being labeled shameless. And yet, Roman culture insisted this brutality was civilized. Philosophers argued that women were naturally irrational and required firm control. Legal scholars reinforced this belief, granting husbands near absolute authority over their wives' bodies. A woman could be punished for refusing sex, for failing to conceive quickly enough, or for displeasing her husband in any intimate way. Even death was not out of the question in extreme cases, and the law often looked the other way. What makes this ritual particularly horrifying is how normalized it was. Mothers who had once endured the same terror now prepared their daughters for it. They offered advice not on how to protect oneself, but on how to endure quietly. Tears were acceptable, protest was not. Some brides developed coping mechanisms that modern psychologists would recognize as trauma responses. Emotional detachment, dissociation, obsessive obedience. Roman texts occasionally mention wives, who appeared unusually calm or cold, praised as ideal matrons, without acknowledging the emotional cost behind that composure. For enslaved women, the suffering was even worse. A freeborn bride at least gained legal status and social protection after marriage. Enslaved women had none. Their weddings were not recognized by law, and their wedding nights were often indistinguishable from routine abuse. Roman masters frequently forced enslaved women into sexual availability as a matter of property rights, not ritual. The silence surrounding these experiences was enforced by shame. A woman who spoke openly about her wedding night risked social ruin. Roman morality placed the burden of honor on women alone. Even victims of violence were judged by how well they maintained the illusion of modesty. Over time, this silence became historical erasure. Later, Roman writers softened descriptions of marriage, portraying it as orderly and dignified. Christian chroniclers, eager to distance themselves from pagan brutality, omitted the worst details. Renaissance scholars romanticized Rome's grandeur while ignoring the suffering beneath its marble surface, but the trauma did not disappear simply because it went unrecorded. Archaeological evidence, private letters, curse tablets, funerary inscriptions, suggests that many Roman women lived with deep, unspoken anguish. Some inscriptions mourn girls who died shortly after marriage, hinting at complications, abuse, or despair. Others praise wives for obedience and silence with unsettling emphasis, as though quiet suffering itself was the highest virtue. The horrifying truth is this: Rome's wedding night ritual was not a flaw in an otherwise enlightened society. It was a feature. It reinforced male authority, controlled female sexuality, and ensured the continuation of patriarchal power. The empire's greatness was built not only on conquest and law, but on the silent suffering of women whose pain was never meant to be remembered. And perhaps that is why Rome tried so hard to erase it. Rome did not forget the horrifying wedding night ritual by accident. It buried it, methodically, deliberately, and with a level of narrative discipline that matched its talent for conquest. What survived into the modern imagination of Rome, white marble, solemn togas, dignified matrons, lawful patriarchy, was not the Rome that existed in flesh and blood. It was the Rome wanted remembered, and the brutal ritual of the wedding night did not belong in that carefully sculpted memory. By the late Republic and early Empire, Roman elites were acutely aware that history was power. Who controlled the story controlled legitimacy. As Rome transitioned from a city of tribal customs into a world empire, it needed its past to appear orderly, rational, and morally superior to the barbarian's eye. Ruled, ritualized sexual violence, public humiliation of brides, and communal enforcement of female submission were not compatible with that image. So the practice was slowly excised, not always outlawed, but quietly abandoned, rebranded, or written out of respectable discourse. The first step in erasure was language. Early Roman writers described the ritual bluntly, using words associated with seizure, domination, and conquest. Later authors replaced these terms with euphemisms. What had once been acknowledged as violent initiation became symbolic transition, ancestral custom, or rustic tradition no longer practiced. By changing the words, they changed the moral temperature. Violence cooled into metaphor. The second step was selective preservation. Roman historians such as Livy and Dionysius of Halicarnassus were not neutral recorders, they were curators. They chose which customs to detail and which to mention only in passing. When they discussed early Roman marriage rites, they emphasized fertility symbols, religious blessings, and legal contracts, not the wedding night itself. When references to the ritual appeared, they were often framed as archaic oddities of a primitive past, safely distanced from civilized Rome. Religious reform also played a role. As Roman marriage became increasingly formalized under law, particularly during the Augustan moral reforms, the state sought to present marriage as a stabilizing institution rather than a spectacle of domination. Augustus's laws promoted marital fidelity, legitimate heirs, and public morality. A ritual that revolved around terrorizing a bride contradicted the image of marriage as a cornerstone of social order. It was not that Rome suddenly became humane, it simply became strategic. Yet erasure did not mean disappearance. The ritual's logic survived even after the ritual itself faded. The idea that a bride must be broken, humbled, or stripped of autonomy on her wedding night persisted in subtler forms. Public jokes about a bride's fear. Ritual tears encouraged as signs of modesty, the expectation that a woman's first sexual experience should involve pain, submission, and silence. These were cultural aftershocks, echoes of an older violence now normalized rather than ritualized. In elite households, the ceremony vanished first. Among rural populations and poorer citizens, fragments of the custom lingered longer, sometimes stripped of religious framing but retaining the core act, the public assertion of male ownership over a woman's body. By the time Christianity began reshaping Roman morality, the practice was already ghost-like, rarely described, occasionally hinted at, never celebrated openly. Christian writers, interestingly, contributed to the burial in their own way. While they condemned pagan sexual excess, they also avoided detailed descriptions of earlier marriage rites. To them, such rituals were not worth preserving, they were embarrassing relics of a sinful age. Silence became a moral weapon. What was not written could not easily be remembered. Modern historians uncovered the ritual only by reading between lines, by noticing inconsistencies, offhand remarks, and defensive denials. When a Roman author insists too strongly that our ancestors were virtuous, it raises suspicion. When a ritual is mentioned only to be dismissed as misunderstood or exaggerated, it suggests discomfort. Rome protested too much. The final layer of erasure came centuries later, during the Renaissance and Enlightenment, when Europe looked to Rome as a model of rational civilization. Scholars translated Roman texts selectively, glossed disturbing passages, and emphasized law, architecture, and philosophy. The wedding night ritual did not fit the narrative of Rome as the cradle of Western progress, so it remained buried, footnoted, or ignored. Yet remembering this ritual matters, not because Rome was uniquely cruel, but because it was systematically honest about power in its early years. The ritual exposed a truth later generations preferred to hide. Marriage was not originally about love or partnership. It was about control, lineage, and public enforcement of gender hierarchy. The terror of the wedding night was not accidental, it was instructional. By erasing the ritual, Rome did not absolve itself, it merely passed its logic forward in quieter forms. And by recovering it now, history regains something important, the ability to see civilization without its makeup. Beneath the marble statues and legal codes lies a society that understood exactly what it was doing, and later worked just as hard to make sure no one remembered.